The French government urgently asked the United States for military help in Vietnam. Their soldiers at Dien Bien Phu were close to being defeated by communist forces. About 15,000 French troops could be lost if help did not arrive soon. France wanted American aircraft carriers, bombers, and fast action. President Dwight Eisenhower read the message and looked at the advisors in his office. His vice president, Richard Nixon, supported helping France. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles agreed. Admiral Arthur Radford, head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, already had a military strike plan prepared. Everyone in the room believed the United States should get involved. The only question was not whether to act, but how fast American forces could respond. Dien Bien Phu was a valley in northern Vietnam near the Laotian border. In late 1953, the French flew about 15,000 soldiers there. General Henri Navarre believed this strong base would force the Viet Minh to fight in an open battle. The French had better artillery and air power. They thought they could defeat the Communist army in a major battle. It followed traditional military strategy. But there was a big problem. The base was in a valley surrounded by high hills. The Viet Minh commander, General Vo Nguyen Giap, understood the mistake. The French had actually trapped themselves. Giap spent months moving heavy artillery through thick jungle that the French believed could not be crossed. He placed more than 200 artillery guns in the hills around Dien Bien Phu, including Soviet-made Katyusha rocket launchers, which the French called Stalin's organs. By March 1954, the French forces were completely surrounded. Viet Minh artillery could strike anywhere inside the valley. French planes trying to deliver supplies were shot down. The soldiers inside the base were slowly starved and constantly bombarded until they were close to surrender. 2 months earlier, John Foster Dulles gave one of the most important foreign policy speeches of Eisenhower's presidency. In it, he introduced a new idea called massive retaliation. He said the United States would not try to match communist forces soldier for soldier or weapon for weapon. Instead, America would respond quickly and strongly at a time and place of its own choosing. This clearly suggested the possible use of nuclear weapons. Dulles was warning that even a regular communist attack could lead to an atomic response. The speech was meant to scare the Soviet Union, but it also put pressure on the Eisenhower administration. Now, France was asking for help in Vietnam. If Dulles truly believed in massive retaliation, this was the time to show it. Communist forces were close to defeating an important Western ally. Many believed in the domino theory, the idea that if Vietnam fell, other countries in Southeast Asia would fall as well. Dulles had promised a powerful and immediate response. With the French base about to collapse, the world was watching to see whether America's threats were real or just words. Vice President Richard Nixon believed the United States had to step in. He warned President Eisenhower that if Vietnam fell, the rest of Southeast Asia could also fall to communism. Nixon was also thinking about the 1956 election. a communist victory might make Eisenhower appear weak. Admiral Arthur Radford already had a military plan prepared. 2 aircraft carriers, the USS Essex and the USS Boxer, were in the region and could begin airstrikes within 48 hours. Radford believed American air power could stop the Viet Minh attack and rescue the French forces. Most members of the National Security Council and the Joint Chiefs of Staff agreed that the U.S. should intervene. Congressional leaders said they would support military action if America's allies joined as well. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles began contacting Britain, France's closest ally. Winston Churchill, who had warned about the Iron Curtain in 1946, seemed like someone who would support stopping the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. President Dwight Eisenhower had led the largest military operation in history during World War II. He had sent soldiers to fight and die on the beaches of Normandy. Because of that experience, he understood something many of his civilian advisors did not. Wars rarely end the way politicians expect. Since 1946, he had watched France try to regain control of Vietnam as a colony. The French were fighting to protect their empire, but many Vietnamese people, even those who were not communists, strongly opposed French rule. Eisenhower told his team he could not imagine sending American ground troops to Southeast Asia. He warned that the war could slowly pull in large numbers of U.S. soldiers. His advisors argued that air power alone would be enough. Admiral Radford promised that aircraft carrier strikes could break the siege without sending ground forces. But Eisenhower had heard similar promises before. During World War II, leaders had believed strategic bombing might defeat Germany without a ground invasion. That had not worked. In the end, millions of soldiers had to fight across Europe. Eisenhower suspected Vietnam might turn into the same kind of long and costly war. Yet almost every advisor around him was urging him to take action. Inside Dien Bien Phu, the French soldiers were slowly dying. Viet Minh artillery had destroyed the airstrip, so supplies had to be dropped by parachute. Many of those supplies fell into areas controlled by the Viet Minh. The French troops were first put on half rations, then quarter rations. Some were forced to eat rats just to survive. Wounded soldiers could not be flown out. Field hospitals were overcrowded with casualties from constant shelling. French officers sent urgent and increasingly desperate messages to Paris. They said they needed immediate help or the base would be defeated. The French government passed these messages on to Washington. The message behind it was clear. The United States had already paid for about 80% of France's war in Vietnam. If America truly wanted to stop the spread of communism in Southeast Asia, this was the time to act. Either American air power would rescue Dien Bien Phu, or 15,000 French soldiers would become prisoners of the Viet Minh. John Foster Dulles traveled to London to meet British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Churchill was 79 years old and serving his second term. Dulles expected him to support military action to stop communism in Vietnam. But Churchill's answer was clear and immediate: no. Britain would not join a military intervention to save the French position in Indochina. He told Dulles it was better to jaw than to war, meaning it was better to talk than to fight. Dulles was shocked. Churchill had been one of the strongest anti-communist voices in the West for years. However, Churchill had also experienced colonial conflicts. He understood the situation the French faced. He believed the Vietnamese were not simply fighting for communism, but to end colonial rule. In his view, American air power would not change that reality. Churchill refused to send British forces into what he saw as a lost cause. Army Chief of Staff Matthew Ridgway had been reviewing Admiral Radford's plan for airstrikes from aircraft carriers. He then asked for a private meeting with President Eisenhower. Ridgway had commanded American forces in Korea and understood what fighting in Asia involved. He told Eisenhower that airstrikes alone would not solve the problem. The Viet Minh could simply move into the jungle and wait until the bombing stopped. To truly save the French position, the United States would need to send ground troops. Ridgway estimated that at least 7 American divisions would be required. If China joined the conflict, that number could rise to 12 divisions. He warned that Vietnam's terrain was even more difficult than Korea's, and keeping supply lines open would be extremely hard. He also pointed out that France already had about 200,000 troops in Vietnam and was still losing. How many American lives would be lost trying to defend something France could not hold? Eisenhower listened closely. Ridgway was the only senior military leader advising against intervention. While others promised a quick victory through air power, Ridgway warned that it could turn into a long and costly ground war. President Dwight Eisenhower held a full cabinet meeting on April 3, 1954. He wanted to hear every opinion before making a final decision. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles spoke first. He warned that if Vietnam fell, other countries like Thailand, Burma, Indonesia, and eventually the Philippines could also fall to communism. He said the domino theory was not just an idea, but a real geopolitical danger. Vice President Richard Nixon argued that Eisenhower could not appear weak against communism, especially with the 1954 midterm elections coming soon. Admiral Arthur Radford insisted that just 2 days of heavy bombing would break the Viet Minh siege. After that, French reinforcements could rescue the trapped soldiers. He believed American ground troops would not be needed. Eisenhower then asked an important question. What would happen after the immediate crisis? The French were already losing the larger war. If the United States stepped in, would America be ready to take over France's colonial role in Southeast Asia? President Dwight Eisenhower met privately with congressional leaders to discuss the crisis. He explained the French situation and the plan for aircraft carrier strikes. Senate Majority Leader Lyndon B. Johnson and House Speaker Sam Rayburn gave him a clear answer. Congress would support military action, but only if America's allies joined. The United States could not act alone. If Britain and other NATO allies participated, Congress would approve the use of force. If America intervened by itself, there would be no support. This gave Eisenhower political cover. Winston Churchill had already refused to join the effort. Without British involvement, Eisenhower could tell his advisers that intervention was politically impossible because Congress would not authorize it. But Eisenhower knew that was not the whole truth. The deeper reason was that he did not believe American military power could fix what was essentially France's colonial problem in Vietnam. On April 26, 1954, President Dwight Eisenhower made his final decision. He told his staff that the United States would not intervene militarily at Dien Bien Phu. Having fought in 2 world wars, Eisenhower understood that military force alone could not create political solutions. The Vietnamese wanted independence from colonial rule, and American bombers could not change that. France was fighting to keep its empire, and if America stepped in, it would be seen not as a liberator, but as the new colonial power. He also agreed with General Ridgway's warning: airstrikes alone would not work without ground troops. Eisenhower told his advisers what he had privately believed for weeks: the United States simply could not commit its forces against the massive populations of Asia. There was no way for America to intervene in Indochina on its own. The decision was final. On May 7, 1954, Dien Bien Phu fell to the Viet Minh. After a 56-day siege, the entire French garrison surrendered. More than 2,000 French soldiers were killed, and another 11,000 became prisoners of war. The news hit Paris like a thunderbolt. France's colonial empire in Southeast Asia was finished, and the country had lost the will to continue the war. Back in Washington, Eisenhower's advisers were stunned. John Foster Dulles told reporters that the United States would have joined the fight if Britain had agreed. Vice President Richard Nixon privately complained that Eisenhower's caution had handed Southeast Asia to the communists. Admiral Radford believed his carrier strike plan could have succeeded. But Eisenhower showed no regret. He believed he had made the right decision. The real question now was what would happen next in Vietnam. In mid-1954, representatives from France, Vietnam, the United States, China, and the Soviet Union met in Geneva to negotiate the future of Indochina. The French and Viet Minh agreed to a ceasefire. Vietnam was temporarily divided along the 17th parallel. The North would be controlled by Ho Chi Minh's communist government, while the South would be led by a pro-Western government. Elections were scheduled for 1956 to reunify the country, though everyone knew they would likely never take place. John Foster Dulles refused to sign the Geneva Accords. The United States did not want to accept responsibility for an agreement that divided Vietnam. At the same time, Eisenhower would not try to overturn the settlement. The war was over for the moment. Republican Senator William Knowland called Geneva the greatest victory communists had won in 20 years. Eisenhower said nothing publicly, but privately he believed that avoiding American military intervention had saved thousands of American lives. In January 1955, President Dwight Eisenhower approved the first shipment of military aid to the newly created South Vietnam. He also sent military advisors to train the South Vietnamese army. These advisors were meant to be temporary. Their job was to help build a stable, pro-Western government in Saigon and then leave. This was very different from sending American combat forces. Eisenhower's administration also helped install Ngo Dinh Diem as South Vietnam's president. Diem was anti-communist and pro-American. He was autocratic and unpopular, but he was the best choice for keeping South Vietnam out of communist control. The number of American advisors slowly grew. By the end of Eisenhower's presidency in 1961, about 900 U.S. military personnel were in South Vietnam. They were training troops, not fighting. Eisenhower had drawn a clear line: no American combat forces in Vietnam. When John F. Kennedy became president in January 1961, he inherited Eisenhower's Vietnam policy. South Vietnam was still unstable, but remained independent. Kennedy's advisors recommended increasing U.S. involvement. The same voices that had urged Eisenhower to intervene at Dien Bien Phu were now pushing Kennedy to escalate. By 1963, Kennedy had increased the number of American advisors in Vietnam to 16,000. He also allowed U.S. pilots to fly combat missions, breaking Eisenhower's principle of keeping American forces out of direct fighting. Kennedy justified this by saying the advisors were not combat troops, they were helping South Vietnam defend itself. But in the jungles, the line between advising and fighting disappeared. American soldiers were now dying in Vietnam. After Kennedy's assassination in November 1963, Lyndon Johnson inherited the same situation. He escalated even further. By 1968, more than 500,000 American troops were fighting in Vietnam. Matthew Ridgway's warning in 1954 had been painfully accurate. He predicted that intervening in Vietnam would require at least 7 American divisions, and as many as 12 if China joined the war. Eisenhower had listened and refused to intervene. Kennedy and Johnson did not heed that warning. By 1968, more than 500,000 American soldiers were fighting in Vietnam, the equivalent of 27 divisions. The reality had far exceeded even Ridgway's worst-case scenario. The war that Eisenhower had refused to fight in 1954 ended up killing 58,000 Americans by 1975. It cost over $140 billion, destroyed Johnson's presidency, and divided American society more deeply than any event since the Civil War. And it ended exactly as Ridgway had predicted. The Vietnamese communists won. No amount of air power, ground troops, or money could create a stable pro-Western government in South Vietnam. The same challenges that had doomed the French in 1954 doomed the Americans in 1975. Eisenhower had understood this in 1954. His successors had not. Throughout the 1960s, Eisenhower watched the Vietnam War escalate. He rarely criticized Presidents Kennedy or Johnson in public, but in private he was frustrated. He had shown them a way to avoid the trap. The question Eisenhower had asked in 1954 was the crucial one. What happens after immediate military success? Carrier strikes might have saved Dien Bien Phu temporarily, but then what? Would American forces have to occupy Vietnam forever? Would they fight an endless counterinsurgency against nationalist forces? In 1954, his advisors had promised quick victory through limited action, but they could not answer his questions about long-term consequences. Kennedy and Johnson's advisors made the same promises decades later and had no better answers. Eisenhower understood a fundamental truth. Military force alone cannot solve political problems. You cannot bomb people into accepting a government they do not want. The hardest word a president can say is no, especially when everyone around him is saying yes. In 1954, every advisor urged Eisenhower to intervene in Vietnam. The political cost of doing nothing seemed enormous. Yet Eisenhower said no. He understood that true restraint often takes more courage than action. His decision was unpopular at the time. Dulles, Nixon, and Radford thought he had made a historic mistake. History, however, proved Eisenhower right. Avoiding Vietnam in 1954 saved countless American lives and preserved U.S. credibility. Kennedy and Johnson faced the same choice, and they said yes. As a result, 58,000 Americans died. Leadership sometimes means accepting short-term criticism to prevent long-term disaster. It is the courage to remain still when the world is screaming for movement. In 1954, Eisenhower chose wisely. His successors chose differently.